Welcome to Colonize the Ocean podcast, where we discuss oceanic colonization, exploration, and education with your hosts Adam Jewell and Brendan Traxler.
Today, I want to talk about Tektite and the Tektite missions. For those who don't know, with Atlantic Sea Colony being or having the goal of putting habitats underwater, Tektite was habitat formed by different government, scientists, universities, and industries. One of the major ones was GE, General Electric, and back in the late 60s. And 69, this habitat was put together and sunk in the Virgin Islands, Lancashire Bay. When I say GE, when I first come across Tektite, I had assumed it was General Dynamics Electric who made the submarines, since Tektite was involved, or government was involved with Tektite. And I was wrong. It was actually General Electric, the company, not the submarine company. And that's why I put in my notes about it. Just because being an underwater thing, I had assumed it was submarines, and I was wrong.
So what was GE's involvement? I mean, what was their interest in
I
it?
don't know what their interest was. I had a hard time finding, but it said they had a big hand in designing it. So that makes me wonder if a lot of the electrical stuff for it was GE's involvement, or if they actually had involvement in the actual structure of it.
Interesting.
Some of the things that were noted in some of the places about Tektite is the fact that it had a working refrigerator, freezer, things that draw a lot of power. Even in today's world, with the efficiency we have, things that are drawing a lot of power underwater.
But they're all GE brand too.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It's like, if I could find a good enough photo, it'd be interesting if you could zoom in to see if that's what it was, this GE brand. But the way this thing was designed is it's basically two cylinders side by side. And a description I thought of is if you took two paper towel rolls and put them on a donut box side by side, that's kind of what it looks like. There was a connecting tunnel at the top of not the very top, but at the top end of the paper towel tubes, if you will, that connected the two cylinders. It was 4 rooms in all. It was a total of 4 rooms, 2 rooms, two levels in each cylinder, one on top of the other. And one was a main living area. One was the bridge is what they call it. So it was like a communications, mostly communications, where they would communicate with the surface. But it was also a working lab for the scientists, because that's something about Tektite, with the universities and scientists being involved in it so heavily. They did a lot of studies on, and they very specifically, and everything I read about it, very specifically nocturnal, daytime and nighttime living of underwater marine life. So they were really looking into it, hardcore, I guess you'd say, at that point. The first mission, so Tektite 1, and that's what actually separates the different Tektite 1 and Tektite 2, if you read about it, it's the same habitat building, it's the same structure, but it was separated by the mission sets, is what actually separated it. So the first mission set was basically the proof it could be done, similar to Cousteau's work, proof of what could be done. And NASA, I don't know how much government was NASA, but NASA also had a big interest in it. So as much as the scientists, the people staying in the habitat were there, they were also being studied by surface, a surface crew. The habitat itself was powered, and the plumbing, the generator, I guess you'd say, most of it was offshore, but some of it was inside the building itself, inside the habitat itself, because the top tier of the other structure was an engine room. That's what they called it, and they didn't give a lot of specifics of what was in there that I could find. Maybe I just looked in the wrong places. But you had a living area, and on top of that, the bridge, and you crossed the tunnel into the engine room, and then the next level down on that side was your entrance pool with a bathroom and laundry facilities, so they could do their own laundry down there too. So now you're talking washer and dryer, because it specifically pointed that out too. So again, goes back to General Electric, just a guess.
Yeah, and something like that works, especially when you're usually, you look at you're trying to mitigate as much electrical pull and stuff as you want, and you got some heavy duty stuff down there pulling that type of electricity. Something else you said that I thought was interesting was the differentiator between 1 and 2. You look at ConShelf and C-Lab and all the different programs, there's a different habitat for each different number. Yep. And when I've always looked at pictures in the past, I was like, well, I want to get pictures of Tektite 1 and Tektite 2. And you can never find it. When you're searching them, it always comes back to the same habitat. And that's why, because they're the same one. But you look, like I said, you look at ConShelf, which we'll talk about at another time too. There was 3 distinctly different habitats there, which I think makes Tektite, it makes it special, I think.
Yeah, it does. They built it to last. That's one of the things that I didn't put in my notes I was reading, but I wanted to talk about, is because after the missions were all ran, Tektite 1 and 2, this thing was taken out and dry docked and sat in storage. And then I forget the exact dates. I wish I'd wrote them down now, but that's okay. Roughly the early 1980s, they refurbished it and were going to sink it again for active use. And the funding for active use that way ran out. So they toyed around what to do with it and decided to use it as an educational museum. So they parked the thing and let kids be able to run all through it and stuff. But it just kept deteriorating. And then I can't remember, I want to say it was late 80s, early 90s, they let a school of welding, kids learning welding and torch use, scrap it, turned it into scrap steel. And it just breaks your heart to think of it that way.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking when I was reading your notes. I was like, man, to be some kind of billionaire and just have like your backyard full of all these old habitats that, had no homes and just, but you can't save everything, and it served its purpose. But yes, it is a shame.
Yep. That's especially the history that was done with it, because that takes me back to the missions. The first mission was 4 different people. I have it in my notes here.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what the specific missions were. What were the purposes and stuff.
Tektite was done after which I want to do as much as I can find something on the Navy Sea Labs missions too, because that was a different habitat also.
Mm-hmm.
They did their own. The Tektite was after them, but Navy. I mean, they still were involved in this, so it was studies on human behavior, endurance. How long? Because that first mission was 60 days. It was 4 men stayed there for 60 days in that first mission. Um, behaviors, yeah, it's. So I went over some of that already. I'm looking for the names of the gentlemen. There they are: Ed Clifton, Conrad Mankin, John Vander Walker, and Richard Waller. Those are the 4 men who stayed there for 60 days. And again, it was people watching them as well as them doing things every day. They were outside of that habitat for at least 5 hours. Doing
And how deep were they?
So around 45 feet deep.
Okay.
So 13, little over 13 and a half meters.
They're at 2 atmosphere, more or less.
Yes, so it was kept. That is one of the things that I made sure to put down, that they kept the atmosphere 2.5.
Okay.
That's the way they, because they saturated
Yeah.
the divers just to be able to come and go as they wanted, and they kept the atmosphere at 2.5 atmospheres to allow that. That's what so for 60 days.
Yeah.
And then they would have had to been allowed to decompress before they were able to surface at the end of that 60 days.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's to give you an idea. So you're 45 feet down, and each cylinder was 12.5 feet across, and 18 feet tall. Yes. So each cylinder is 18 feet tall. It's almost 20 foot tall,
Mm-hmm.
and 12.5 feet across. So you're stuffing a lot of stuff.
Well, I was thinking, at that depth too. I mean, really, you go to the top floor, you'd be almost at 1 atmosphere if it wasn't equally pressurized, stuff
Yep.
Potentially, because it'd be up in less than 20 feet of water at that point in time.
Yeah, and exactly. So yeah, that's why I know I made the point of in the notes I saw where they kept it a constant 2.5 in that habitat, and that's why. That, and you got your waves above, so if you get a big swell, all of a sudden you're you're 60 feet underwater instead of 45. Yeah. That was the first mission. It was an endurance thing and psychological. I think it had a lot to do with what they were looking at, because the NASA was looking at it for their astronaut program. They were looking real hard at it, is my understanding. They wanted to see if people were going to go crazy living in such close quarters together. And of course, now we've got International Space Station where, they're doing it all the time, year round.
Yeah. I still think, I don't care what anybody says, there's still got to be some cycle. You have to be a special person to be able to do that and not be able to come out and go to the mainland every once in a while. It's not for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. That's, to me, it's interesting to see what the seasteaders are doing in its own way. I know it's the surface.
Yeah.
But I think at the same time, you're still running into the same issue. You're at the surface, but it's not land. It's not the way, maybe if you were born out there, raised out there, it would be a different thing. Now we're going into the water world, sci-fi water world, right?
Exactly. I was going to say that. Yep.
Yeah,
at least with the psychological, you can easily get on a boat and head to land, but in space or underwater, especially if you're saturated, you can't easily get and go to land if there's a medical issue, if there's a family issue, something along those lines. You're stuck for however long that decompression time is, or if you're in space, how long it's taking you to get back down to Earth. So yeah, there's I think that psychological aspect comes into play a lot with it.
Absolutely. But to me, I always look at the economy of things. So you get over so you get into the future and you have it as a common thing. People live in habitats on the ocean, and most of them aren't going to be real deep at all. But because of that, it's going to create, I guess you'd say, an underwater ambulance system,
Yeah,
unless it's turns into a big city with its own hospital,
right.
place there. So you're going to have submarine ambulances, and what'll be special about them is they'll have to be able to decompress you if you're living in a place where you're saturated.
Yep.
If it's not kept at your one atmosphere, if you're
Hmm.
saturation diving or living. So and I just think that's going to be its own niche of
Yep.
a thing in the future. Then it'll have to be. The economy will just happen for it, like it has in the history of mankind, I
Absolutely.
guess.
Absolutely.
But that was really the point of a lot of that first mission, because except for the Navy stuff, the Sea Lab stuff, not a lot was done where a lot of scientists were involved to really get their hands, I guess, dirty, if you will, on all that data that could be brought out of it and used for things like NASA. And well, I would almost assume that a lot of submarine studies were done, because you take World War II, Vietnam had just happened here when this was done. So you take all that with the submarines, you psychological again.
Yeah.
You're stuck in a tube underwater. They're ideally with habitats, you're able to come and go as you want. Look outside. The scenery is there's scenery, which makes a lot of difference for people.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
can.
Absolutely. Yeah. That need for the sunlight is a big one, I think, too.
Yeah,
And so you get that as
absolutely.
well. So, so what other different programs or
The
whatever?
missions.
Yeah, missions that they do.
The the Tektite, that was actually Tektite 1. So it was that 60-day long mission. Tektite 2 was a run of 10 smaller missions.
Oh, well, okay.
And uh, they they said around 60 different scientists and personnel, engineers, stayed in the habitat for those 60 missions. There was usually 5 people in those missions, but the missions were much shorter. They weren't they weren't 60 days. I want to say they're like 2 weeks is what I want to say they were, and it was 5 people. So the bunk system allowed people to live in that main living room. Above that living room was the bridge, and the bridge had its own area where they could pull out a cot or hammock, and one person could sleep there as well, right there, and never
Okay.
leave that station. So that when if you're communicating with the surface or whatever you're doing, you're able to stay at that station, whether awake or not. You're there,
Yeah.
and it's hard to find, and at least I was unable to find a lot on all the 10 different missions. What you did find, though, which is cool, was especially for the time frame, for the time era. It was Mission 6, they called it. It was actually the 5th mission, but it was called Mission 6. And it was an all-women crew, and it was people that, a lot of them, if you're, pay attention to the underwater world, you would recognize the names of. Sylvia Earle is probably the most popular one, the most heard name. That was her baby. And in the August 1971 National Geographic issue, she had a write-up that was describing a lot of that mission. And I've always admired her because she's always had a way to bring artistry, um, almost a poetic way of describing and saying things about the underwater world. And she does that just like,
Yeah.
just that she is her in that article. And she does that in that little article because the whole article is first about Tektite, and then the second part of the article is about um, that specific mission. I have links for YouTube videos if you're a person that's interested in seeing and want to know the history of this. I have links for YouTube videos that are about Tektite, and one of them interviews Sylvia Earle, and they called the Aqua Babes. That was one of them. They had several different names that they were called that would make you cringe today, but it's
The Aquanauties.
yeah, that was one of them. Absolutely, the Aquanauties. In the day, it was everything sensational, I guess
Yeah.
you'd say. Which that was another thing that I was wondering about GE. And I would like to know if there was television commercials.
Mm,
This is our stuff underwater, and it's so good to work
yeah.
underwater. It'll work, for you. That kind of thing. I always wondered if that was part of the thinking of them being involved in it.
Mm.
That's
That's
yeah.
crazy to
There's
think that
several
it's 50,
videos.
51 years ago.
Yeah. What's neat is how it seems slow as you're living it, but you look back and it's amazing how fast the technology for all that has just advanced so
Yeah.
much. It's really neat.
But yet, we
It,
still have a bunch of underwater habitats out there either for it being
yeah,
51 years too. So,
yeah. But that's that. The thing you were involved in, the Ignition Con here not too
yeah,
long ago. So Sylvia Earle was part of that.
yeah,
Jan Koblik. There was others, and I can't remember all the names right now, but that were involved in Tektite.
yep,
And they were all they all live streamed together and had discussion on a lot of the underwater future facilities and habitats, which is really neat. I know you've got that up on YouTube, so we'll have to put a link to that in here too.
yeah, yeah. And what you were saying about Sylvia earlier, and I saw that firsthand at the Ignition Con thing where it was, she wasn't given an idea basically what we're doing. She just came on there and we asked her, she was asked a couple of questions and she just flowed. I mean, it was just like second nature to her to talk about what was. There was no hesitation. There was no, I need to think about this. It's just, she lives and breathes it.
Yeah. And I've always been impressed because I think the best way for me to say it, I always thought she painted a picture with her words.
Mm.
Whether it's just, even if it's just a scientific fact, she still does it for you. It's right to it. I was been impressed by that. Yeah.
Very much so. Yeah. Very cool. So any other fun facts for us here about Tektite?
So yeah, when I say it's 12.5 feet wide, the entry room. So the donut box part of Tektite was a protective measure as well as a wet lab. So there was parts of it, I guess you could say it was their own little underwater aquarium where they would keep an eye on something by stashing it or having a specific place for it in that donut box area. But it also, if you see the pictures of this, had like a caged entrance and stuff because the horrible man-eating sharks are going to get you. At that time, that seemed to be so much of the popular thinking that's what they did. They put these caged entrances
And that's
on
first
just bars.
and that's the first thing I thought when I saw those gates was looks like a shark cage.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what it looks like. It looks like the side of a shark cage.
Yep, and that's literally what it is. It's and that's their entrance. So
Yeah.
they go in there, and then they come up into a moon pool in that wet room. And that wet room, I know I said before, it had its own laundry station. It had a shower facility. It had a private bathroom. They said it was small, but it was a toilet and sink there. It was your own private bathroom, and then of course storage for coming and going for wetsuits and well, your underwater gear, I guess would be the best way to say it. So somehow they crammed all that into that space, and it's my understanding the freezer was up in the engine room. That was so Bruce Collette wrote an article about Tektite and its missions, and it's not real long. It's a real short thing because I attached it to be attached to this too, just because I talk about it. And his conclusion then was that underwater habitats are a viable thing for the future, which at that point they were just doing it for study points.
Yeah.
So either Bruce is someone who is really excited about underwater stuff like we are, or he's looking to say, yeah, it's the real thing. And to me, the more you look at it, there's so much of a push for fuels, foods, all coming from the ocean. And by foods, I'm talking kelp and seaweed, and fuels, the same thing. I'm not talking fish. They know they can make better fish farms than what are done now just by existing at that same place. And then coral restoration, that would be another thing. They're doing so much of it, which is really neat, all the different places that are doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And just think, if you're living right there with it, is it Seasteaders? Is that who has already started building that into their bottom structures?
Ocean Builders.
They've
talked about. Yeah, they've talked about. Yeah, that's one of their ideas. Yeah.
Because that spar, or those spars that go down in the water that hold it steady, they're saying at the bottom of that they can put that current that'll run through it and shape it or attach the 3D stuff to it that they've got to encourage coral growth there.
Yep.
So they're trying to make their own reefs, which is really neat.
Absolutely.
They can do that.
It's one of those things where I think that it's like I think I've said before that it's almost a no-brainer, especially when having an underwater habitat and you've got a view, is you need to enhance that as much as possible. I mean, you want the beauty, and so if you can grow your own coral right there and attract your own fauna and flora and everything, yeah, why not?
Yeah, and eventually you're going to have enough that you can farm some of it for personal use without hurting it.
Yeah. Well, babe, you got anything else you want to share with us on this or?
Not that I can think of on this one. Just I would say if you're at all interested in looking, there are YouTube videos that should be attached here to this. That watch them. They're really interesting. They're not real long, and they'll open your eyes to other things, all the other involvements that were either came from or were involved in these underwater habitats.
Yeah, man. Well, hey, thank you for doing this. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. I got more.
All right. We'll be looking forward to it.
All right.